Bibi makes a comeback. Benjamin Netanyahu looks set to return as Israeli prime minister, but could building the nation's most right-wing government in history be good for Israel? And what could it mean for Palestinians? I'm Andrea Sankin. Today's newsmaker is the Israeli election. Well, he's currently on trial for corruption, but that hasn't stopped Benjamin Netanyahu from potentially making a major comeback. The Likud party leader is set for a sensational return to power just 1 year after his ouster.
But one thing is already clear. Our way, the Likud's way, has proven itself. I remind you that from 52 seats in the last election, we are on the verge of a very big victory.
Well, Israel has struggled to form a functional government over the last 5 years, making this the 5th election since 2019. Many saw this vote as a referendum on Netanyahu himself. His supporters believe he's the victim of a political witch hunt, but his critics argue he is not fit to govern. Still, exit polls predict his right-wing bloc will pick up either 61 or 62 seats in the Israeli Knesset, enough for an overall majority. In a moment, we'll debate what a Netanyahu victory could mean for Israel and the wider region. But first, let's take a closer look at the leader himself.
In 1984, Benjamin Netanyahu was appointed Israel's ambassador to the United Nations in New York. 4 years later, he returned to Israel, winning a seat for the Likud party in the Knesset. By 1996, Netanyahu becomes Israel's youngest ever prime minister, serving until 1999. He returned to government in 2002, first as foreign minister, then a year later as the finance minister, a post he resigned from in protest at Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. In 2009, Netanyahu is once again elected prime minister. 4 years later, he secured another term, and then again in 2015. In 2019, Netanyahu's popularity took a hit after being charged with bribery and fraud. In May 2020, he became the first serving prime minister to go on trial. But despite facing criminal charges, Netanyahu still won a record 5th term after agreeing to a power-sharing deal with political rival Benny Gantz. But after serving for more than a decade, the Israeli PM was ousted.
Well, Netanyahu is a seasoned politician, and he knew he couldn't win this election alone. So the former Israeli PM reached out to the far right, in particular, this man. Itamar Ben-Gvir heads the Jewish Power Party. The ultra-nationalist is a controversial figure and was convicted of incitement of racial hatred in 2007. His anti-Arab rhetoric seems to have resonated with a number of Israelis, leaving Bibi to use Ben-Gvir's popularity as a path back to the premiership.
The public wishes for leadership that will protect the land of Israel, that will develop the Negev and the Galilee, that will protect our capital Jerusalem, and will settle Judea and Samaria. The public voted today for Jewish identity.
So as Israel turns further right, how will the country and the region adapt? Joining me now to debate what led to this outcome and its impacts are, from London, Zalmi Unsdorfer. He is the chairperson of Likud-Herut UK. From West Jerusalem, we have Mitchell Barak. He served as an aide to Benjamin Netanyahu and was a speechwriter for former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And from Geneva, we have Gideon Levy. He is a columnist for Haaretz newspaper. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let me start with Mitchell and ask if this is a sad day for you, seeing what you called the most diverse and representative government in Israeli history lose to the most right-wing government the country has ever seen.
Well, I'm not really here to give my personal opinion and feeling, but I do think that the last government, we could celebrate a success in that it was diverse, in that it included Israeli Arabs for the first time in the government. They passed a budget, which was an amazing thing. But there were people on the left and on the right, people who were religious, people who were secular. And from that point of view, it was, I think that government was a wonderful thing. for Israelis and for Israel and how Israel faces the world. It's a nice face to show everyone that we have a diversity of opinions and diversity of people in a government. So from that point of view, the election results now look like we are going towards a very right, very religious, very ultra-Orthodox government, which doesn't sound, I mean, two parties which have almost 20 seats have no women representatives on them, the ultra-Orthodox. The religious Zionist party has expressed things which many people find offensive, and definitely the electorate is definitely the right of center here, and even the hard right. And it looks like a government can be formed like that. We still don't know, again, the final results, and we still don't know what the government will look like and whether Netanyahu will include all of those right-wing parties, because there's a possibility that they may split and that he might not use them, or he might try and get other people that are to the center or center left. And we also don't know if all of the players of the parties, the chair people and people in the parties, are going to stay in politics, because some of them who went into politics were looking to defeat Netanyahu have found that after 5 elections, that's really not possible. And do they really want to stick around and be in the opposition for the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? And again, try and do that. So it's not clear.
Okay.
But what is good and what makes me happy is Israelis voted. They voted in droves. The turnout was very good. And we have a democratic process, and we all have to respect
Some
that.
voted in droves. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But Zalmi, first let me ask you, I mean, did you see this coming? I ask you that because you spoke briefly to my colleague yesterday, and it seemed you didn't quite expect Netanyahu to win, and you had an idea as to why. So are you celebrating today?
Certainly celebrating. I was very, very concerned that Netanyahu had lost a lot of his gravitas being absent from power for so long. And, you know, his pitch used to be, I'm the only guy who knows how to fly the plane. Well, somebody else has been flying the plane during this recent period under Bennett and recently Lapid. So that kind of rings a little bit hollow. So I'm very, very pleased to see him back, a firm set of hands at the tiller. And just remember, you know, we've gone through 5 years of misery here, and an absurd situation where someone with 6 seats became prime minister. That just is not right on any level.
But do you agree with Mitchell at all that, I see Mitchell doesn't agree with what you just said, but let me ask if you agree with Mitchell from before, saying that this new, you know, likely to be government actually really strips the Knesset and the representation of diversity in Israeli society?
Yes, I mean, I take Mitchell's point regarding that there's no women in the firmament, but I personally have been a big supporter of Ayelet Shaked. I think she was a great justice minister, and I'm really sorry that she was not brought into the Likud family. I think the Likud result would have been a lot better even than now had she been brought in. We're not a sexist party, and I'm sure that eventually will be seen in Likud's ministerial appointments.
Okay, Gideon, tell me what you think is actually going to change now with this new fabric in the Knesset, and should Palestinians be afraid?
Palestinians shouldn't be afraid. They went through everything. It's in many ways the end of the masquerade, the end of the illusion that Israel is a democracy, the end of the illusion that it can be both a democratic and a state in a regional state, the end of Israel as the darling of the West. The right wing, it's not about Netanyahu, by the way. It's really about his partners and the force and the power of his partners. The extreme right wing in Israel is by far more extreme than what we are witnessing now in Europe. Nothing to compare between the extreme right wing in Israel with Italy, Sweden, or elsewhere. It is a very radical, militant right wing, and Netanyahu is going to be captured by this because he has no other choice. He has to depend on them in order to stay in power. And this is really the radical change of yesterday,
And
not continuing having Netanyahu.
yeah, speaking of the more radical change, you have Jewish Power Party leader Itamar Ben-Gvir. You know, he was convicted of inciting racial hatred and other terror-related charges, and he now wants to run the public security ministry. With his party's, I believe, now the third largest in the Knesset, according to these preliminary results. Now, he says he's renounced extremist beliefs, but has he? And where will that alone take Israel?
That's ridiculous. I mean, I know him, and I even, in a way, like him, because at least he's sincere. He says what he thinks, and he thinks what he says. And in many ways, we have to realize that Ben-Gvir represents a very authentic and very well spread voice in Israeli public opinion. When I spoke about ending the masquerade of Israel as a democracy or Israel as a Western country, Itamar Ben-Gvir is exactly the proof for it, because Itamar Ben-Gvir is in his beginning of his way. He might become even prime minister one day. Don't underestimate his power and his plans. And Itamar Ben-Gvir is right now the real face of Israel. And that's a face that many Israelis are ashamed to see, but they have to realize that that's a very authentic face of Israel.
Okay, so Mitchell, now that we have Ben-Gvir, you know, biting for the public security minister position, which he might very well get, do you think, you talked about voter turnout and how high it, well, okay, go ahead. You don't think he'll take that position?
Listen, I do think. Yeah, listen, he's never really run anything. You know, he's never really run anything. And the one chance he had to start his own political party, he kind of maneuvered and made it look like he was really going to start a political party so that Mr. Smotrich would put him on the list high enough with all of his people. So you don't usually put someone who has no experience in a position like that. I will remind you that Avigdor Lieberman from the Israel Beitenu party ran on a platform a number of years ago saying, if I am the defense minister in 48 hours, the Hamas will be obliterated. We all know that he was not effective against the Hamas. So what people say in an election is just to, you know, rally the base, and that's what they wanted to hear.
Okay.
But there's no connection to reality, and I don't see Netanyahu, you know, taking irresponsible moves like that.
Okay. We'll see how that plays out. But, you know, you had spoken earlier about how impressed you were with Jewish Israeli voter turnout. We haven't gotten the final numbers, but it could be actually historically low turnout for participation of Israeli Arabs, 20% of the Israeli population. Do you think right now, today, these minorities regret not voting because, you know, they could have kept this government out by casting not a vote of support for the coalition government as it was before, but at least a vote of strategy to minimize the kind of damage they might see now? Yeah.
But you know what? I think they've been in Israel long enough to mimic the Jewish parties in that they can't get along. They can't get along, and they have these ideological differences. And not only were they running three parties, but they couldn't even sign voter surplus agreements with each other. So what happens is once you hit a certain number of Knesset seats or you don't get in, then your votes go to another party that you signed an agreement with, or their votes go to you. So the party leadership of those parties couldn't even do that. So that's pathetic. That's a pathetic endeavor that they couldn't do that. And the apathy of their voters, you really have to ask them why didn't they turn out and why didn't they come vote. But, you know, even after 5 elections, the Israeli Jewish vote turnout was very high. I think almost the highest in 20 years, more than 20 years. And that speaks a lot to the resilience of Israelis, that even after this lame process of few years of voting and no government, they still, you know, participate in the system. And I think that's a very good sign.
Okay.
They definitely have to, you know, in the Arab sector, they should be having an awakening.
Okay. Zalmi, I do want to get your take on, you know, Ben-Gvir kind of biting for the public security minister position. I mean, Mitchell seems to think it's pretty unrealistic, but what do you say?
I think Ben-Gvir is talking about the most important issue in Israel right now. I think even more than the economy. Public security is has become a serious problem in Israel. Starting off with the riots in Lod during the last rocket attacks, when there was literally mayhem in mixed Jewish and Arab cities, which was effectively lit up by the fact that there's so many guns in the hands of Palestinian Arabs and also Israeli Arabs. He is playing to that concern amongst the Israeli public that we really need to restore deterrence, not just in terms of public security, but also in terms of the IDF. It's time that the gloves were taken off and that people were not able to taunt soldiers with impunity when rules of engagement have become so liberalized and so politically correct. He is going to restore deterrence. And it wasn't just him. Yitzhak Rabin, a centrist prime minister, used to say, we need to break bones in order to get peace on the streets. And there will be peace on the streets with this new government.
But you would realistically then see him in that ministerial position, just to be clear.
Yes, I would actually like to see him in that, yes.
Okay. Gideon Levy, I mean, when you hear Zalmi talking about restoring deterrence, how does that speak to Israelis? Does it make sense to most of them? Does it make them feel safe?
Unfortunately, yes. The Israelis are looking for a harder hand, even though it's quite hard to become much harder than the IDF and more brutal than the IDF, especially in the last year, by the way. But yes, the Israelis, most of them, not all of them, are looking for a harder line, for more violence, for more brutalism and barbarian behavior of the army, of the police, as if this will solve something. We know from other histories that this never solves anything. But when a people is bloodthirst, so you have to satisfy it.
Then what's the end game?
The end game, if it goes on this way, the end game is a formal establishment of Israel as an apartheid state, maybe forever, with very clear, even legal divisions between the two peoples. And then the only challenge will be directed at the world. Will the world deal with the second apartheid state as it did deal with the first apartheid state in South Africa? Or will the world continue to hug Israel and to believe that Israel is a democracy?
Right. I want to talk more. Hopefully, we have time to go further into, the global implications of all this and how other nations, allies, will interact with Israel going forward. But Gideon, let me just ask you quickly. I mean, do you think by taking up potentially the prime ministership again, Netanyahu will evade the criminal prosecution that has been, clouding his political history and future for this long now?
It's not about me to answer. His potential partners answered it already. They declare, Ben-Gvir and others declare that they will do anything possible to change the legislation so his trial will be cancelled practically. And even if Netanyahu will not be active about it, I can trust his partners because this is what they promised. That they will bring an end to it. The trial of Netanyahu is a major factor in the political life of Israel right now. And the door is open now to major changes.
Okay. Mitchell, quickly, do you think the criminal prosecution will go forward, or will this new government be able to scupper that?
Well, I mean, legally it has to go forward and the trial is going on. There's talk about changing laws retroactively. I don't know how you do that really. But I think the more relevant thing to focus on is for the majority of Israelis in this country, they really just don't care about the trial. And it doesn't impact whether they're going to vote for Netanyahu, and it doesn't impact them whether he's on trial and probably whether he's even convicted, whether he can run the country and whether he's the right guy to run the country at this point. So I think that's really the major story, is that public opinion in this case of Netanyahu absolutely doesn't care. He's been, and this is the fourth election that he's been run either in indictment or trial. It's just not a news story anymore.
Okay.
You know, and there's people on the witness stand saying that he took this bribe and he took that bribe, and it's just not news for a lot of people. They
Okay.
just turn it off.
Yeah, okay. You know what, I'm going to move it forward at this point. We're down to our last 5 minutes. So Gideon was talking about, you know, how relationships will develop from this point forward with international allies and other global players. Mitchell, I can start with you here. You know, very recently, Ukraine has asked Israel, for example, for help providing defense weapons in the conflict with Russia. Israel has wanted to stay, I guess, neutral. But some are accusing Netanyahu of actually just kind of allying himself with Putin because that's what he thinks is better for Israel's position here. Where do you see that relationship going? Because it's so fundamental to global dynamics right now.
Well, I think it's an excellent question and excellent observation. Israel, from the beginning, did not really want to get involved in this conflict, although everyone knew where Israel's, what was important for them, because we have interests, both Jewish interests in Russia and Syria and Lebanon and so forth. So we haven't been as forthcoming as many would like with the support of Ukraine. But actually, as critical as I have been of Netanyahu over the last few years and some of the things he's done, he actually might have been the right guy to be in the prime ministership when this whole thing started with Ukraine and in Russia, obviously, when Russia attacked and invaded Ukraine. Bennett was called over to try and, negotiate or to try and be a mediator. But the fact is Netanyahu is one of the few world leaders that has a real relationship with Putin. And this might be an area of all the areas, believe it or not, where he could make a contribution or could be able to at least, see what's the way out. What's the way out here?
Well, Zalmi, let me ask you where you see Netanyahu taking that relationship with Putin specifically.
I agree with Mitchell that he's probably the best placed of all to engage in this really, really tricky situation where Israel national interest is in making sure that it has freedom of action in Syria against Iranian missile deliveries and so forth. So it is very, very sensitive, and all politics is domestic politics, and Israel has to mind that situation. But I think, yes, compared to Bennett going to Moscow, Netanyahu has very, very big shoes, and no one has been able to fill them anywhere near as close.
What about then relationships going forward with the Arab and Muslim world? I mean, some congratulate Netanyahu on being able to restore relationships with, Gulf partners, for example. Do you see that continuing to progress on this scale?
I see it flourishing in a big way. He's the one that started this, not just in terms of the Arab states, the Gulf states, but also in Africa, forging alliances. He's a master at that. And I think it's going to get a lot better, which is better for the world and for the whole oil situation.
Gideon, better for the world?
No, when it comes to the relationship with those Arab regimes, Arab countries that Netanyahu established the relationship, this will continue and it is good for the world. The only problem is that we are continuing to break away from the core issue, which is the Palestinian problem and the Israeli occupation. And this, obviously, Netanyahu and no other Israeli leader right now have any intention to solve. And as long as this will not be solved, nothing will be solved.
Okay. Final minutes then, and I'm going to bring it right back to Israel. Does anyone think, or have, and I shouldn't say think, is there the crystal ball of sorts? Mitchell, I'll start with you, for how long this government will last. You've got 5 elections in 4 years. Could this one sustain itself? Could this result be the one that actually holds for a significant period of time?
Well, I'll tell you, the math here is if Netanyahu, let's say, has 62 or 63 or 64 seats in his coalition versus Lapid or Gantz, let's say, in 62 or 63, it's not the same kind of 63 or 62 because Netanyahu's 62 or 63 are solid. There are people that are either in the Likud, in the ultra-Orthodox parties, or in the religious Zionist party that are with him, and they're not going to bolt on ideology or some other thing, okay? Whereas the problem that Bennett had as prime minister and Lapid's party and Gantz's party is that people were peeling away from those parties. There was no glue or cement sticking them together. And Netanyahu's people are really, really cemented to him and cemented to the right of center ideology. The other thing is Netanyahu, as an opposition person, voted against things that were core to the Likud and core to his own supporters and ideology, like extending Israeli law to the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And that's why the government fell. And there were other budgetary things. Now, Netanyahu goes all the way. He's willing to, cut off his political nose to spite his face as long as it brings down the government. Gantz and Lapid and those other people, they don't have the guts to do that.
Okay.
They don't have the drive to do that. They'll vote for the right thing, but without bringing down
Hence,
the government.
Netanyahu has been called the master politician. Okay, Mitchell, that'll have to be the final word. So unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.